Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this Legal Issues webinar series brought to you in collaboration between the NCEA and Loyola Marymount University. My name is Thomas Pigg, and I'm happy to be your host today on behalf of the NCEA. Today's webinar, View from DC, Legislative Updates and Outlooks, is presented by Sister Dell McDonald. Sister Dell, as most of you know, is the Executive Director of Public Policy at NCEA and spends a great deal of time advocating for our Catholic schools in the halls of DC. Now, before I pass it off to Sister Dell, we have a few housekeeping items. We encourage you to check out all of our other sessions and more information for this series on the Eventbrite page. We also welcome your feedback, so if you would like to share your experience with us, please complete the post-session evaluation for this webinar and others, which you can access on that Eventbrite page. Now, let us begin as we all do all things. In the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. Lead us not into temptation, deliver us from evil. Amen. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Now, once again, we'd like to thank you for joining us, and it is my pleasure to turn this over to Sister Dell.
Thank you, Thomas, and welcome everyone. This will be an update on what's happening at the federal level impacting Catholic education. What I'll talk about will be some of the political climate in which we're trying to operate on behalf of Catholic schools. We'll look at the COVID legislation for K-12 schools, which is the very big part of this presentation and of great importance for our own schools. We'll look at the guidance that the Department of Education put out, what it says, how we're supposed to be getting money, and then some controversies around it that have caused some consternation and some delay. We'll talk about consultation, what the private school officials should be doing to get the appropriate funding on behalf of their schools, and then some other federal legislative issues that are under consideration before Congress. So a word about the highly politicized climate in which we're operating. As most of you are aware, over the past few years, and not just the last 3 or 4, but going back even farther than that, we've had a great deal of political gridlock, a lot of partisan infighting in the Congress and with the president, and very little willingness to compromise. And so most of the legislation that gets proposed goes nowhere because they don't get both sides of the aisle, as they say in Congress, to agree. At NCEA, I work on behalf of NCEA with the Council for American Private Education for the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops and other private school organizations, and have people representing their associations in DC. And we have been working very, very hard to stay above the political infighting, that our focus is and will remain on the students. What's good for the students, for their teachers, their schools, their families, and try to keep out of the political infighting. However, that's easier said than done, and we do find ourselves at times trying to work among some hostile forces. But be that as it may, we keep trying. We believe our cause is just, and we are about helping students and families obtain the education that's best for their family, their child, and get some help in doing so. So we deal with the Trump administration, which has campaigned in the past on school tax credit program, has included choice and religious liberty in State of the Union addresses. But so far, an executive order was issued by the president in terms of religious liberty, but we haven't had much activity on the part of school choice. Now we're hearing that they do have a bill that the White House is trying to send up to Congress and get a sponsor, but trying to get a sponsor for some of these issues, particularly in a re-election year for all of the House and several of the senators is difficult. With the Congress, we've dealt with the CARES Act, which did get bipartisan support. The CARES Act is the big bill that provided emergency relief in a variety of ways for unemployed people, for families that were struggling, for institutions, and for schools. That bill passed and we were working on it. The Democratic House has passed a bill on the HEROES Act, which is an amendment to that I'll talk about in a minute, but there is no action in the Senate. So we're dealing with a Congress that is basically on the Democratic side unfriendly to choice, on the Senate side not coming forward, and then many of the people in the Democrats, particularly in the House, are at odds with the Secretary of Education. So that makes it even more difficult to get an education bill through. And then we work with the Department of Education on the implementation of these programs. So the department has come out in support of choice, the Education Freedom Scholarships, which would be a national federal tax credit program, and the 529 expansion of those college tuition program savings that could be applied to K-12. But that has had several different reactions. The EFS has not had a sponsor gain enough to have that go before the Congress in either house, and the 529s are subject to state regulations. So the Department of Education did provide guidance that would have allowed private schools to obtain a good deal of the services that the CARES Act would have put in place, but that is now stalled, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So the COVID-19 legislation, the CARES Act, which, as I said, provided a number of issues, and many of our schools did take part in one of the benefits under that, which was the Small Business Administration Payroll Protection Program, the PPP, which enables schools and churches and other institutions, along with small businesses, to obtain loans at 1% interest, and up to 75% of the loan would be forgiven if it was applied to keeping people on the payroll. I'm not really spending much time on that. The CARES Act is where we have significant opportunities for our schools. The Education Stabilization Fund is part of the CARES Act, and that has two programs. The GEAR Fund, the Governor's Emergency Education Relief Fund, that has almost $3 billion in it, and the ESSER, the Elementary and Secondary Emergency Relief Fund, that has $13 billion in it. And you notice they're both called relief funds, and that's important in the ongoing conversation about how we participate. Under ESSER, the money that is in that program is directed to the states, and then the states send it to the districts to respond to coronavirus and related school closures. So the use of the Corona Emergency Relief Fund under ESSER is to allow a number of activities that would get the school able to maintain its operations and continue services basically to students. Both this secondary ESSER fund and the Governor's Fund require equitable participation of private school students and teachers. And that's an important piece. If any of the funds under GEAR or ESSER are used to provide services to K-12 schools in a state, in a local district, then private schools ought to be included equitably. And what you can use these benefits for are spelled out in the CARES program. And first and foremost is that you can use it for any activity that is authorized under ESSER and the IDEA, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. So any of those programs that you could use it for under IDEA or Title I, II, III, IV would be acceptable uses for the ESSER funds. It also goes beyond that to really looking at what's here, providing training for principals, eventually for teachers, to get them able to implement whatever directives come from the CDC, the Center for Disease Control, from the local agencies, government agencies, about getting the school ready, having the school sanitized and cleaned, having professional staff that can maintain those sanitary requirements, having supplies on hand. You know, once you go back to school, you still have, as you've been reading in all of the papers and education materials, what happens when you go back to school? The social distancing, the masks, the constant cleaning. You need supplies to do all that. And under ESSER, you should be able to use the funds to get what you need to make the school safe, to make the school accessible to students, and to continue learning. And so part of that continued learning would be purchase of education technology, so that when this was passed in May, we were expecting that money would start to flow within weeks, and that schools could obtain necessary equipment so that teachers and students, particularly those of low income who do not have good connectivity or have 3 or 4 students in a family with one computer, would be able to be provided materials to continue their education. So far, none of the money has been flowing. It's tied up, and this money has another year to be spent. You have until 2022 to use these funds, so that in preparation, you're looking ahead to see if this happens again, if there are closures, if there's an outbreak, what do you need to keep the school going and having it at hand. We also look to see that as under Title IV, there are benefits for providing mental health services and supports for students. Many of the students returning to schools will have had some serious contact with family members, with those they know, with friends who have lost members. Children are traumatized. We may need to provide a lot more services to have kids feel comfortable coming back to school and engaging in learning. And then this next long paragraph basically says, you know, hopefully you can use it for summer school activities. It's not going to happen this summer because it's almost over, but next summer, to help make up for some of the lost time. And then it also addresses the needs of low-income students. This basically mirrors what's in Title II, III, and IV. And then other activities to maintain the operation and continuity of services. And that's what's important. We're trying to provide students education under a variety of forms, depending on what happens. Whether your school can open full-time with everyone there every day, or if you have to go to some hybrid model of in class some days, part days, and then remote learning. So I just take a moment here to say a big thank you and a word of appreciation to all of our principals and teachers who have made heroic efforts during this period to keep the schools operating in virtual mode for all of our students. We have done superior work in terms of keeping students engaged way beyond what many of the public schools have been able to do. And it's a big kudos to, as I say, our principals and teachers and our families who have helped with that, to put children's needs first and continue to work for their benefit. So once the HEROES Act, once the COVID original CARES Act was passed, it immediately became evident to many members of Congress that there wasn't enough money there, that more money needed to be appropriated for a variety of things. So in the House in May, they passed the HEROES Act, Health and Economic Recovery Omnibus Emergency Solution. So this is not a good sign for private schools. Within the HEROES Act, they repeat many of the things with more money that helped a lot of agencies and individuals. The education section, though, has put $58 billion more into education for K-12 schools, but it specifically excludes all private schools from new funding. This is the first time private schools have ever been excluded from a benefit that's publicly available to others. And not only does it exclude private schools, it retroactively amends the CARES Act to limit the funds for students in private schools to only Title I students. Students who this year had Title I services are all they want to serve, which is in contradiction to, and which is an act of defiance basically to what the Secretary of Education says, the way in which the law should be implemented. And I'll talk about that in a minute. And then there's also a provision in the HEROES Act that limits the Secretary of Education on the use of the funds, because there is a small amount, that the secretary can use at her discretion to help schools and families. And they want to make sure that it's not going to allow her to use anything that furthers school choice. So it passed the House with all Democratic votes, no Senate, no Republican votes. And the Senate has not yet taken up the bill. Senator McDonald, chair of the head of the Senate, has said it's dead on arrival. But Senator Schumer has introduced a bill, it hasn't moved anywhere, that pretty much mirrors the HEROES Act. It doesn't mention not including private schools. It says that you would include only those who are receiving Title I. So the Senate is not taking up the bill anytime soon. So right now we're looking at just the just the CARES Act as what is on the table. So the CARES Act, and I mentioned earlier, the word emergency relief has been part of CARES and even in HEROES. And so what we're looking at, what we in the private school community are looking at and have worked with the Department of Education on, is to treat this as an emergency aid program the way it did every other emergency program, going back to Katrina for the hurricanes and Harvey and Maria, and all of the other relief programs in an emergency included private schools on an equitable basis. In the CARES Act, they did use the Title I. They referred to Title I as the way in which the money would get to the states and then to the districts. It was a formula that was in place. They did not have to create a new one. So basically, every state will get from the CARES Act the same amount of money it got for Title I for the past year. And then it gives to the district the same amount of money. And it reminds the states and the districts that the provisions in Title I about requiring timely and meaningful consultation with the private schools for equitable services must be followed. So what's really important here is, and that we have been fighting to maintain the integrity of the program, that the CARES Act does not specify that CARES is an additional funding to Title I. It never mentions that. It's a relief program. But under that program, then, what's required that all students and teachers, and the guidance from the department says this, that all students and teachers in non-public schools are counted. The district says we have X number of students, some are in private, some are in public, and they get services based on that count. The LEA in which the private school is located, that's the public school district, must ask the private schools about their intent to participate in both the GEAR or the ESSER program. And what we tell people is don't wait to be asked, let them know that you want to participate in anything that is eligible for your participation. Again, this program will work the way any other relief program or the title programs work, in that you don't get the money directly in the school, you get the goods and services paid for by the district. So that when you are ordering supplies or you want a sanitation company to come in, the district gets billed and the district pays it. We have some schools that have already started, and the question is, can they get repaid? What we're advising you is to work with the provider to see if the bill can be delayed and then submit it to the district once this controversy about how things are going to be paid is settled. And then for some people who are concerned, this is not a receipt of money. You are not a recipient of federal funds. The district controls the money. So how do you determine the proportionate share of equitable services for private schools? So the department has said you count all the private schools, students who are in the district's boundaries. And so they only need the number. So when they're following that model, all they have to know is what was the enrollment as of the time the coronavirus shutdown began. Under the original directive of the Department of Education, poverty or at-risk status is not part of it. It's like Title II, Title IV. How many kids do you have? What is the proportion of that in relation to the public school? So this is an example that the department put out on how to calculate the proportion. This chart, while it refers to the GEAR and ESSER fund, is the way in which any of the federal programs should be calculated. When you're dealing with your district for Title I, II, III, or IV, this is how the amount you're to receive should be determined. So they say the LEA received $1 million in funding. They got 100,000 from GEAR and 900,000 from ESSER. And so the public school district has 1,350 kids. There are 150 private school kids in that district. So out of the 1,500 kids, the 150 private schools are 10%. So 10% of the funding should be reserved for private schools from the GEAR fund and from the ESSER fund. And so we see not out of the 100,000 that GEAR got, private schools, the 10% of that money and divided by the 150 students would give you $66.67 per student from GEAR. And out of ESSER, it would give you $600 per student. So this is what we thought we were operating under, and this is what the department thought it was putting out as how districts should work. However, the rationale from the Department of Ed to the district that it is an emergency program and all should be counted resulted in a great deal of resistance on the part of the chief state school officers and who run the state education departments and the districts. And they are insisting that it should be a Title I program, not an emergency relief fund. And therefore, only those who had been receiving Title I services would get counted. And most of the SEAs, the state education agencies, did direct their local education agencies to ignore the Department of Ed guidance and proceed as if it were a Title I program, which has set up a controversy and an ongoing dispute with the department. What's important to understand are the parameters. The Title I funding goes to the states from the federal government using a formula that calculates low-income students from US Census data, so that whatever the jurisdictional boundaries are of the district in the census tracts, that's all those kids get counted, whether they're in public or private schools. They count the household kids. When the district gets the money, it is supposed to be serving low-income students. And in a public school, they may have enough poverty count that they can serve everybody. For the private schools, they don't serve every low-income student who might be eligible. If you recall from your Title I programs, the student has to live in an eligible attendance area. The eligible attendance area is what the district says it is. So in my private school, I'm located in District X, and I have in my school 74 kids who are from low income. They qualify for free and reduced price lunch. They probably get financial aid. And they are across the spectrum of K through 8. If I'm in elementary school, the public school district has decided that the schools in which my children in public school would have attended, that in those schools are not all title attendance areas. They're only going to serve students in grades 2, 3, and 4 with title funding. Therefore, only students in my school who live in that district, who are low income, that are in grades 2, 3, and 4, generate the funds for this program. So the children who are in grade 1 and 5 through 8, though they may be low income, do not generate the funds, so that all of our low income students are not being served. And what we are looking at is that so many of our students, so in my school with 74 kids, I may only have 12 kids who are in those eligible attendance areas. So only 12 students would get the per pupil allotment, not the rest of the students. And so we are claiming that that is unfair. It is not equitable services. Not all students who are low income are being served. And so in response to that, the Department of Education, under lots of pressure from both Congress and from public school advocates, has decided to put out what they call an interim final rule. When they put out the guidance, that's only a suggestion. The guidance does not have the force of rule. Once they go through the process of creating a rule, then it is mandatory that all districts follow that. So under option 1, they're giving districts 2 options. Option 1 is to count and serve all students in all schools equally as in other emergency relief programs. So this is what, where we are supporting, we're asking that it be used, that every kid is at risk, every kid has suffered under this, and every kid should be used. So they go back and use that formula that I showed you on the chart a couple of slides back. Using all students, count every kid in the district. Option 2 gives the district a choice. It says you may use Title I, but then you have to use it for both public and private. Under the CARES Act, only private schools are mentioned in terms of Title I. So public schools have assumed that they can use the funds for everyone without any restrictions in the public schools, but make only Title I students in private schools count. So that if they choose to do option 2, they have to do poverty counts for both private schools and public schools. So they can either use the 2019, the past school year poverty data, use the program as it was, or they can do a new count of students of low-income families in both public and private using the measures specified in Title I. So they can do survey counts, they can do surveys, they can do proportionality, etc. What the department is urging is that they use proportionality. This is supposed to be a timely and meaningful consultation and process. So waiting till you can get kids where you can give out surveys, collect surveys, and so on, delays this program even way beyond what it has been delayed. So the department is urging that proportionality be used so that if the students in your school are in a district in which the poverty count is 40%, then we would assume that's the poverty count for our students. So what happens now? So the Department of Education has submitted its interim final rule to the Federal Register. This is the way in which a rule gets finalized. It goes into the Federal Register. For 30 days, the public is able to offer comments on what's in the rule. The department reviews that after 30 days and may or may not make changes. So obviously we have some concerns at NCEA about this interim final rule and the way in which it's still, even if they use poverty counts from Title I, is not serving all low-income students, and we will make points about that. So we will make a formal filing in the Federal Register, and we'll provide talking points and directives to superintendents and principals to assist them if they choose. So we would hope when we get our talking points together, when we line up what it is we think makes the most sense in terms of appealing this ruling, we would invite others in the Catholic school community and others in the Council for American Private Education. All of the private school advocates are working with their groups to see if we can get a large number of responses, because we know the public school have already rejected this compromise and are lining up to file comments. So for now, what we're urging everyone to do is to remember that timely and meaningful consultation is required. We hope to be able to get some money flowing even during the dispute, so that you will be able to open schools in a timely fashion. So what should the principal or whoever is the person dealing with the district for the consultation process? Ask the LEA, which option are they using? If they're using option 1, in which all students are to be served, you begin the consultation process. What's our proportionate share, and how much do we have to spend? And then you present your list of things that you need to be paid for by the district. If you are using, if they use the proportionate share as it was, okay. If you have, this is a problem, if you have students in your school, which most of us do in Catholic schools, from a number of districts, if the district is going with option 1, then you have to go through option 1 with each of the other districts. All right, so that they're only option 1, they're only going to serve the students who would live in that district. So this multiplies the work you have to do, and frankly, it multiplies the work the district has to do, but they're apparently willing to do that. So we will see where that goes. So if you have a problem getting timely and meaningful consultation, the guidance directive from the department says go first to the state ombudsman, and then if not, contact the Office of Non-Public Education and file a formal complaint. And I have information at the end of this about those contact information pieces. While this is all going on, trying to get your ESSER or GEAR, you still have ESSA funds from Title I. For most of our schools, you have not used all of your Title I money, your Title II money, your Title IV money, and possibly your Title III money. That if you have funds, they are yours to use because you couldn't use them from this extraordinary circumstance during the closure. So the Department of Education said that they are doing waivers, that all funds can be carried over, not just 15% as the law says in normal times. You can carry over all of the unused funds from your proportionate share into the new school year, so that you can begin, working with the district to use some of those funds that will help to make up for some of the CARES funding that's not coming yet. So for Title IIA, you can get funding to support teacher education. Many of the principals and teachers will need additional professional development to continue quality virtual education for students. Under Title IV, if you go back and look at those parameters for Title IV, there are ways in which it can be used for promoting safe and healthy schools, safe and healthy students, technology, particularly under the waiver regulations in Title IV, where you could only use 15% of the Title IVA money for technology. There is now no limit. So money there can be used, again, in addition to COVID money. So please make sure when you're dealing with your districts that all of what you have on the table should be used because your students are entitled to it. So just a reminder that there is a strong possibility that the SEAs and LEAs who disagree with the rule that you have an option for Title I or for serving everyone, they're ready to file an injunction to hold up this implementation. So again, the districts say Title I, the districts that are appealing say Title I is only for private schools and they can do what they want. So unfortunately, if this gets to a legal fight, which it looks like it may, funds are going to be held up from CARES even longer. But go back to your other LEA ESSER programs and make sure that at least that money starts to flow while they're working out the COVID. So that Title IV money particularly could be used to help sanitize your schools and get them ready. Then apart from what we're dealing with, there are other federal issues on the table. NCEA, USCCB, and all our K partners did sign a letter to congressional leaders as a coalition looking for additional aid to prevent private school closures. We know that for many of the schools in which parents have been unemployed, have not been able to pay the tuition, are still unsure about what their status will be next year, that schools are on the brink of financial collapse in a lot of instances. And so what the coalition letter is asking Congress to set aside 10% of any new COVID relief funding to provide emergency aid to private schools, so that 90% of the new funding would go to public schools, 10% would be set aside to help private schools. It's a long shot, it's a big reach, but it is something that we are working hard to see what that would look like. And what we're asking for is an emergency appropriation. So that 10% for one time would be used to develop an emergency tuition grant program for low to middle income families. So that that money would go to the states that want it to add to their tax credit programs or to create a tax credit program. And so each state could receive up to the amount of Title II funding that would be applicable for families to apply. And then going forward, that if you take, as a state, you receive these grants, you would implement an education freedom scholarship. That is a federal tax credit program. If a state sets up a tax credit program, families and corporations that contribute could receive a federal income tax in addition to if states have a state income tax. So this is a long shot, but it is a recognition on the part of some congressional leaders, on the part of the administration, that private schools have been particularly hard hit and that we do not have the backup resources that the public schools do. For most private schools, most Catholic schools, more than 80% of the revenues come from tuition. In addition to not having collected that tuition, many don't think they can have it paid going for the past couple of months going forward. And then many of you, I'm sure, had to cancel your spring fundraising events because you weren't able to have people gather. So that's an additional hard hit. And one of the points we're trying to make, as public schools are struggling to figure out how to get their schools open and account for their students, if they find thousands of more students coming from closed private schools, their situation will be even more dire. So we're not sure where this is going. We hear that the administration is trying to get a package to Congress, but we will see where that goes. But we'll keep monitoring this and working to see what relief we can get. In addition, we're working with the Homework Gap Coalition that has been formed, looking across all spectrums, all kinds of public, private schools and other institutions that serve students, looking for ways in which to provide more money for broadband connectivity. Many schools who do participate in the E-rate program do get some benefits, but you can't buy equipment, you can't buy hotspots or an additional broadband. So what we're trying to work through Congress and through the FCC is to get some extra help for families that don't have the resources they need to be able to provide students with virtual learning that's meaningful and effective. And working with these programs, we're looking at being able to continue virtual education. There is a bill, it's part of the original program. Providers were asked not to disconnect families who couldn't pay their bills for broadband, for internet. That expires June 30th. So there's an Emergency Broadband Connections Act that's in Congress now that would ask for families that qualify for low-income services, what they call the Lifeline program, would be able to get $50 a month toward paying their bill. That's still up for grabs. And then the Rural Broadband Act, FCC is looking for a lot more money because the rural areas are finding it harder. We're working to support all of this and trying to make it possible for those who need additional help to be connected to get what they need. Another note, the payroll protection program, I mentioned that earlier. Some schools, many of our schools did get these small business loans. That has now been extended to August 8th. There's billions and billions of dollars left in that program that schools who have not applied might be encouraged to apply, schools, churches. The important thing to remember is if you got one loan, you can't get a second. So this is only for people who did not apply. And then another issue that we're looking at, this is really a decision, not necessarily federal legislative, but following the Espinoza decision, that was the Montana school choice case that ruled favorably this past week that you can't deny a benefit to a faith-based school, faith-based institution, simply because it's faith-based. And so the Department of Education last week put out a directive that's part of the Higher Education Act, but this is important for some of our teachers that the public service loan forgiveness. That's the program that public school teachers were able to apply for that reduced their loan and eventually paid it off if they taught in high need schools. Now, if you are in a Catholic school that's in one of those zones that the Department of Education has identified as eligible for the public service loan forgiveness program, you are eligible to participate as well. So you can find information about that on the Department of Education website. And so that's a quick overview of what's happening. I'm happy to provide answers. If you have sent in questions, we can do that via email. My email contact is up there at the top. NCEA on our public policy website, we do have updates constantly on the federal education programs and benefits, and I encourage you to look there if you have some questions about things are working. And then there's a contact for the Department of Ed, and then the important piece to the bottom, the U.S. Department of Education, the Office of Non-Public Education. Maureen Dowling and her associates are always willing to help. So that kind of wraps up what is in front of the federal lawmakers, and we are working to see that what is eligible for public school students would be available for private schools on a fair and equitable basis. So I thank you for your time and attention, and let me know if I can be of further help. So thank you for tuning in.